The water temperature in the North Atlantic on the night of April 7, 1945, was recorded at 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Not freezing, not quite, but cold enough to stop a heart within minutes, and cold enough to slow a body to something so near stillness that stillness and death become the same word. 2 men went into that water. Both of them were lost, but only one of them stayed that way. The Valkyrie broke apart over open ocean. Shield. Then still the SSR, still scrambling, still folding its last desperate intelligence nets across a Europe that smelled of smoke and surrender, picked up the debris signature 3 days later. They found wreckage. They found ice forming over wreckage. They found the temperature dropping in a way that had no easy explanation, and they logged it as anomalous, and they told themselves they would return when the war was finished, and the war finished, and they returned, and they found nothing. Or rather, they found the wrong nothing. They found a man-shaped absence where a super soldier should have been, and they labelled it loss, and they moved on, and the years moved with them. This is the story that didn't happen. This is the version the world almost told. In the version you know, Steve Rogers wakes up. He comes back cold and confused and heartbroken, and the world restructures itself around his return, and the mythology of Captain America becomes a living thing again rather than a relic. But in this version, the version you are settling into now, in whatever quiet space you have made for yourself, Steve Rogers does not wake up. The ice holds. The cold keeps him. And the world has to find a different answer to the question he used to answer simply by existing. In 1964, a Hydra liaison filed a report through channels so deeply buried that it would not be decrypted for another 40 years. The report referenced an asset. It referenced an efficiency rating. It noted, with the particular dry indifference of bureaucratic evil, that the asset had completed 23 operations across 11 countries without detection, without failure, and without memory of having done so. The report did not call him Bucky. It did not call him James. It called him the Winter Soldier, which was a name, but not a name he had chosen. The report also noted in its final line that the asset's left arm had been upgraded for the 3rd time. The arm apparently held up better than the man. The world had told a clean story about James Buchanan Barnes. He had been Captain America's partner. He had fallen. He had been mourned and memorialized and quietly set aside, the way wars set aside the men they use and break, with a plaque and a silence, and an expectation that the silence will be respected. The clean story said he was gone. The clean story said the sacrifice was complete. The clean story, as clean stories almost always do, got the most important part wrong. How the sidekick that history forgot became the shield that history could not plan for starts here. In the cold, in the dark, in the space between what the world decided to believe and what was actually true. Let yourself settle. Let the breath slow. What follows is a long story, but the long stories are the ones that carry the most weight, and this one has been carrying its weight for a very long time. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over old photographs. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of things that were once so loud they wore themselves out. You know the kind. A room where something important happened, and the walls absorbed it, and now the room just stands there holding what it heard. The photographs of James Buchanan Barnes from the 1930s have that quality. Something happened in those images, something that has not finished happening. He was 17 years old when he met Steve Rogers, according to the archived enrollment records of PS 185 in Brooklyn, though the precise year of their meeting has been contested by at least 3 separate SHIELD historical documentation teams over the decades. What is not contested is the shape of the dynamic that formed between them. Steve was small, Steve was sick. Steve was the kind of boy who did not understand that there were fights you were supposed to walk away from, and Bucky was the kind of boy who understood it perfectly and walked into them anyway, because Steve was already in them. This is how the mythology of their friendship tends to be rendered: Steve leading with principle, Bucky following with his fists, and it is true as far as it goes. But it does not go far enough. What the mythology misses is this: Bucky Barnes was exceptional before Steve Rogers had the serum, and the world never quite noticed because the world was watching someone else. He was an athlete. He was a natural marksman, a talent documented by SSR records from 1943 that noted he had qualified for expert level at 17, which was not supposed to be possible for a recruit his age. He was charismatic in the way that certain people are charismatic, which is to say without trying to be, which is the only kind that actually works. He read people the way some people read rooms, intuitively and fast, scanning for what was real underneath what was being performed. He was, in other words, exactly the sort of person you would build a story around, if you were not standing next to Steve Rogers. The 1943 SSR file on Bucky Barnes, first made available to the public in a heavily redacted form through a FOIA request documented in the Brubaker-era Captain America case files, specifically the archival research notes attached to the Winter Soldier arc beginning with Captain America Volume 5, Issue 1, described him as, quote, an asset of unusual reliability and tactical intuition, though his value is currently best expressed through proximity to the primary subject. The primary subject was Steve. Bucky was, in the official language of the organization that would shape the rest of his life, a supporting element, an orbit around a center that was not him. You can imagine what this does to a person. Or perhaps you do not have to imagine it. Perhaps you know it from some quieter version of your own life. The experience of being good at something while someone nearby is better. The experience of working hard while someone nearby makes it look effortless. The particular ache of loving someone whose light casts you in shadow without meaning to. This is not a simple feeling. It is not jealousy, though jealousy might visit it occasionally. It is something more complicated and more forgiving. It is the feeling of choosing the shadow because you believe in what the light is for. Bucky Barnes believed in Steve Rogers the way people believe in things they have watched earn belief from nothing. He had seen Steve when Steve was 90 pounds soaking wet and sick 3 months out of 12, stepping in front of bullies with the particular stupid courage of someone who had decided that certain things were not acceptable, full stop, regardless of consequence. He had seen Steve before the serum made the courage look inevitable. He knew that the courage was the thing, not the body that came to house it. This gave Bucky's loyalty a texture that the mythology tends to flatten. It was not admiration for a superhero, it was witnessing. It was the particular bond that forms when you have seen someone be brave, when being brave cost them something real. The Howling Commandos were formed in 1943, and the records of their operations, declassified in stages across 50 years, with the final tranche released by a SHIELD Transparency Initiative in 2012, show a unit operating at levels of efficiency that military analysts still find difficult to account for within standard models of small unit tactics. 12 missions, 12 successes, 0 casualties. The analysis always focuses on Steve's leadership and his physical capabilities, because his physical capabilities were extraordinary, and leadership is a clean narrative. But embedded in the operational logs, if you read them carefully, is a different story. The person responsible for pre-mission intelligence, for threat assessment, for knowing which guards rotated when and which corridors had cameras that swept on 12-second cycles was almost always Bucky Barnes. He was the one who went in first, not with a shield and a flag, not in a way that announced itself, quietly ahead of the team, learning the shape of the problem before the team arrived to solve it. In the Brubaker narrative, this quality is described by Nick Fury as the thing that made Bucky simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous member of the unit. He understood that some problems could not be solved with a shield. He understood that a super soldier operating in daylight needed someone operating in the dark. He had made himself into that someone, not because he was ordered to, but because he had looked at the mission and understood what it required, and then become that thing. None of this is the story the world tells. The world tells the story of Captain America and his partner, the story of the hero and the sidekick, the story of the star-spangled man and the kid with the rifle who kept up. This is not a malicious distortion. The world was watching something real, but it was watching the visible half of something that only made sense when you saw both halves together. Steve Rogers saved people. Bucky Barnes made it possible for Steve Rogers to save people. These are not the same job, and they do not require the same person, and the second job is not lesser than the first, though history tends to treat it that way. Consider the specific night of November 4th, 1943, which appears in the SSR field reports as Operation Afterglow. The commandos were tasked with extracting a German physicist named Werner Brandt from a facility outside Metz, the facility being a converted chateau now housing a Hydra signals intelligence unit. Steve led the primary assault on the facility's eastern gate. Bucky went through the kitchen drain. By the time Steve's team reached the holding cells, the physicist was already standing in a corridor with a blanket around his shoulders, being guided toward the extraction point by Barnes, who had been inside the facility for 2 hours, had neutralized 4 guards without the alarm being raised, and had found Brandt by the simple expedient of listening through walls for the sound of a man who had been crying for a long time. He found Brandt because he understood grief. He understood it the way you understand things you have lived with rather than things you have studied. His mother had died when he was 11. His father had come home from the First World War with pieces of himself left somewhere in France, and had spent the rest of his short life trying to locate them. Bucky had grown up in a household where the grief was as present as the furniture, where you learned to navigate around it in the dark, where you developed a sensitivity to the emotional texture of rooms, because that sensitivity was a survival skill. This is not something that shows up in the official record, but it shaped everything about him. He knew where to find the physicist, because he knew what hopelessness sounds like when it has gone on long enough to become a habit. The world's judgment, rendered across decades of retrospective analysis, was consistent. Bucky Barnes was a fine soldier and a loyal friend, and his loss was a tragedy, and the tragedy was felt most keenly in the context of what it meant for Captain America. The word partner appears in the official memorials. The word sidekick appears in the unofficial commentary. The word essential appears almost nowhere, and this is the precise gap between what the world decided to see and what was actually there. He was not the sidekick. He was the reason the sidekick story makes any sense. The necessary context, the operational foundation, the quiet engine underneath the visible machine. Sit with this for a moment. In every story about a brilliant light, there is the question of what the light illuminates, and the less asked question of what the light requires to keep burning. Every fire has something feeding it. Steve Rogers burned bright enough to be seen from miles away. Bucky Barnes was the one who kept finding the fuel. The world does not tend to build museums for the people who keep the fire going, but without them, the fire does not go on. And in this particular story, the story where the fire goes out in 1945 and does not rekindle, the question of what remains is not a question about light at all. It is a question about what was always there in the dark, waiting. This is the divergence point. This is where the story you know and the story you're entering now begin to move apart from each other. Slowly at first and then with increasing momentum, the way two rivers split around an island and find themselves in different countries by the time they reach the sea. In the version you know, the train happens. The same train happens in every version, because some things are gravitational. They pull all possible worlds through the same narrow moment, and the only question is what world comes out the other side. The train is Zola. The train is February 1945. The train is a mission that went as right as it could, and still went wrong at the end, in the way that the worst things go wrong, not through incompetence, not through cowardice, but through the pure geometric cruelty of the physical world, which does not care how brave you are, and does not make exceptions for the people who deserve one. Bucky falls from the train. In every version, Bucky falls from the train. But what comes after, that is where the worlds diverge. In the version you know, he is found. In the version you are in now, he is also found. The difference is the order of the finding, and what it costs, and what it leaves behind. Steve Rogers went into the ice 2 months after the train. He went in trying to save the world, which was the kind of thing he did, and he succeeded in saving it, and then the ocean took him. And in the version you know, the ocean eventually gives him back, but in this version, the ocean decides to keep what it found, and the world, which had already spent 2 months rebuilding itself around the absence of Bucky Barnes, now has to rebuild itself around two absences, around the space where the fire was, around the shape that the light left behind. The SSR filed a report on January 1st, 1946, that classified both James Buchanan Barnes and Steve Rogers as killed in action. The report was 4 pages long. The section on Rogers was 3.5 pages. The section on Barnes was half a page. This proportion, more than anything else, tells you everything you need to know about the story the world had already decided to tell. The world had decided Bucky Barnes was a footnote, but footnotes have a habit of becoming the most important part of the page, if you know where to look for what they're actually saying, and if you have the patience to wait for the text to catch up with them. Something was happening in the dark, in the cold, in the space the world had labelled loss, something that would not stay lost. There is a particular quality to mountain air in February. It has a dryness to it, a cleanness, a cold so complete that breathing it in feels almost surgical, as if the air itself is doing something to you, clearing something out, stripping something away. The Alps at altitude in winter smell of pine and ice and distance, a kind of olfactory silence. Whatever happened on that train, it happened against a backdrop of that air, that silence, that cold so specific and so complete that the men who were there and survived never quite got warm again. Not all of them, anyway, not all the way. The operation against Arnim Zola on the Alpine train is documented in 3 separate official sources, none of them fully consistent with the others. The SSR after-action report from February 12, 1945 uses the language of controlled engagement, which is the military's way of saying that the chaos was structured, that the losses were within acceptable parameters, that the outcome justified the cost. The Howling Commando's own informal log, a document that Dum Dum Dugan maintained in a personal journal throughout the war, and that was donated to the SSR archive by his estate in 1971, uses different language. It says simply, "Bucky went out after Zola. The train hit a patch of ice. The railing gave way. We didn't get him back." The third source is the Hydra operational file on the acquisition of Asset WB, which was not decrypted until 2003, when a joint SHIELD NSA cryptanalysis team worked through the last of the Hydra cipher backlog from the war. The Hydra file does not describe the fall the way the SSR file does. It describes a retrieval. It describes a body found half frozen on the mountain face below the train's trajectory, still breathing, the cold having done what the fall could not quite finish. It describes the decision, made by a Hydra field recovery unit, to bring this particular body in rather than leaving it where it lay. The decision is not explained, but the Hydra files from that period operated on a principle of salvage. Nothing useful was wasted, nothing strong was abandoned, and the man they found on the mountain had a profile that matched their criteria. Young, trained, already pushed past the limits of ordinary endurance, a candidate. This is the moment where Bucky Barnes's story splits from everything anyone had planned for it. He did not die. He was not lost to the mountain or the cold in the clean, final way that the world would have preferred. That would have been a tragedy, but a closed one, a tragedy with edges you could find and mark. What happened instead was something the world would not know about for decades, something that unfolded entirely outside the story the world was telling about the war and its costs and the men it had consumed. The world closed Bucky Barnes's file in February 1945 and assumed that was the end of him. The Hydra file opened a new file the same week. The process the Hydra scientists use is described in later SHIELD analysis, with terms that are clinical and therefore somehow more disturbing than dramatic language would be. Neurological restructuring, mnemonic suppression, identity dissolution. These are scientific words for the systematic destruction of a person, for the removal of everything that made James Buchanan Barnes the particular human being he was. His memories, his loyalties, his name, his sense of what he was for and what he cared about, and the replacement of all of it with a set of conditioned responses that made him useful to someone else. The Hydra scientists were very good at their work. This is perhaps the most disturbing thing about them. They were competent. They were thorough. They were professional in the way that people are professional when the work is so morally catastrophic that the only way to continue doing it is to stop thinking of it as anything other than work. They gave him an arm. The original arm, the left one, lost when he hit the mountain, shattered by the impact and by the cold that came after it, was replaced with a prosthetic of remarkable engineering, a piece of Hydra technology that should not have existed in 1945, and which speaks to the degree to which Hydra's science program had outpaced anything the Allied forces knew about. The arm was metal. It was precise. It was powerful in ways that the human arm is not. It was also, in a sense that the Hydra scientists would not have appreciated or cared about, a symbol. It was the clearest possible marker of the fact that the man they had rebuilt was not the same man who had fallen from the train. The arm was the part of him that was new, that was theirs. That was the outward sign of everything they had done to what was inside. He wore their work on his body, and they made sure it was visible. For approximately 70 years, the Winter Soldier operated in the spaces between official histories. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is a documented operational pattern established through the SHIELD Declassification Project, initiated in 2012, which cross-referenced known Hydra activities with a series of otherwise inexplicable incidents across the Cold War and into the post-Cold War period. A Soviet defector killed in Vienna in 1973 in what was logged as a traffic incident. A a CIA station chief found dead in his apartment in Beirut in 1980, with no signs of forced entry and no cause of death that the forensics team could establish. A weapons shipment that disappeared between Hamburg and its intended destination in 1991. The shipping containers found empty at a depot in Poland with no witnesses and no surveillance footage covering the relevant window. The SHIELD analysis team, working backward from the declassified Hydra directives, attributed 17 separate incidents across this period to the same operational asset. The same hands, the same winter. What the SHIELD analysis could not fully account for, what resisted the clinical language and the operational matrices, was the quality of experience that those 70 years represented for the person living inside them. Or rather, not living inside them, because living requires continuity. And the Winter Soldier program was specifically designed to prevent continuity. Bucky Barnes did not experience 70 years of servitude. He experienced a series of discrete missions separated by periods in the cryo unit, the cold chamber, the place where consciousness ceased and waiting began. He was put in. He was taken out. He did what was required. He was put back in. He had no through line, no accumulation of days, no sense of time passing, because time, for him, did not pass the way it passes for people who are awake inside it. He was a weapon between uses, stored appropriately. And yet, there is a detail in the Hydra maintenance logs so bureaucratic and granular that SHIELD analysts have described reading them as similar to reading the maintenance records for a car, that suggests something survived the process that was not supposed to survive it. Periodic entries across multiple decades note the requirement for what the logs call additional calibration following missions, an unusual need for supplementary conditioning sessions, a higher than baseline rate of what the scientists term intrusive behavioral subroutines. In plain language, he kept remembering things. Not everything, not clearly, not in ways he could act on or even fully identify, but something in him kept reaching for what had been taken. Some part of James Barnes kept pushing back through the architecture of what had been built over him, the way water pushes through a wall that is almost but not entirely sealed. The Hydra scientist regarded this as a technical problem, a calibration issue, a flaw in the system that required ongoing maintenance. They were right that it was a problem. They were wrong about what kind. The thing pushing back through the conditioning was not a flaw. It was the essential, irreducible James Barnes, the part of him that had learned, in a Brooklyn childhood and a wartime adolescence, and 2 years of fighting alongside the most principled man he had ever known, that certain things were worth holding on to even when holding on cost more than it seemed reasonable to pay. He was holding on. From inside a 70-year nightmare. From inside a body that had been redesigned to serve someone else's purposes. From inside a mind that was periodically wiped and recalibrated and wiped again. Something in him was holding on. Steve Rogers went into the ice in 1945 and did not wake up. This is the fact that defines this particular version of the story. The grief of it, Steve's friends, the SSR, the world that had built a myth around the man in the ice, is enormous and real and worthy of acknowledgement. But there is another grief that runs alongside it, quieter and less visible. The grief of Bucky Barnes, who lost his best friend on the mountain before the ice even claimed him, and who was then denied even the right to grieve, because the process that rebuilt him removed grief along with everything else. He did not get to mourn Steve Rogers. He did not get to mourn himself. He was not permitted the dignity of loss, because loss requires the retention of what was valued, and the thing the Hydra process was most thorough about eliminating was exactly that, the record of what had been loved. a SHIELD psychological assessment conducted in 2003 by Dr. Yelena Sokolova as part of a broader analysis of Hydra's long-term effects on recovered assets, noted the following. Subjects who underwent the mnemonic suppression protocol consistently exhibited what she termed affective orphaning, a state in which emotional responses remained physiologically intact but were severed from any specific object. The subject could feel grief. The subject could not remember what for. This is, Dr. Sokolova wrote in her report, among the most refined forms of cruelty documented in any modern context. She was a careful scientist who chose her words deliberately, and she chose cruelty deliberately. She wanted the word in the record. In 1945, the world decided Bucky Barnes had died for a cause he believed in, and that the dying was the end of the story, and that the cause, embodied by the man in the ice, the man who would never wake, the man who had traded his future for one last mission, was what mattered, and Bucky was the context for that mattering. The world was wrong about all of it. Not about Bucky believing in the cause. He did, genuinely and without reserve. Not about the dying mattering. It did, in the sense that every life matters, and every loss costs something real. But about the dying being the end of the story. The story was not ending. It was only beginning, in the dark, in the cold, in the 70-year space between the mountain and the moment when what was buried in him finally found enough light to push through. The cold on the mountain faced that February was not the abstract cold of statistical data. It was the specific cold of a specific altitude, the kind that does not enter the body so much as displace it, that makes the boundary between inside and outside lose its ordinary certainty, so that the person in the cold begins to feel not colder, but less solid, less bounded, less definitively themselves and more continuous with the environment around them. This is what hypothermia does at its extremes, and this is the condition in which the Hydra recovery team found James Barnes, suspended in a state that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, the body having made the only decision available to it, which was to commit everything to core temperature and let the periphery go. The Hydra scientist who oversaw the initial assessment, a doctor, Irina Petrov, whose name appears in the decrypted Hydra files as the lead of the Berlin Acquisition Unit's medical division, wrote in her preliminary report that the subject presented with injuries consistent with terminal prognosis under standard care, and that the subject's survival to the point of recovery was attributable to a combination of factors, including exceptional physical conditioning, probable pre-existing metabolic resilience, and what she described, with the particular precision of someone who had trained herself to say what she meant rather than what was comfortable, as an organic resistance to final outcome. Resistance to final outcome. She was saying that James Barnes, on the mountain in February, had refused to die in the specific biological way that the body refuses things before the mind has caught up with the decision. He was not dying because he had chosen to live. He had not made that choice. He was not dying because something in the machinery of him was not done yet, and the machinery had not received the directive to stop. This is, in the medical literature on extreme cold exposure, an extremely rare presentation. The standard outcome for the injuries documented in Petrov's report, the impact trauma, the hypothermic exposure duration, the blood loss, was death, not within any window that allowed for intervention. The fact that Barnes presented as viable was, by Petrov's own assessment, improbable enough to warrant serious documentation. She documented it. She also made the decision, which the Hydra hierarchy ratified within 72 hours, to proceed with what the files called Full Acquisition Protocol. Improbability, in Hydra's operational framework, was not a reason to let something go. It was a reason to see what you could do with it. The world had filed him under loss. But the most dangerous things in the world have always been the ones that were misfiled, the ones that were put away in the wrong category and left there, accumulating, until the category could no longer contain them. Ice at depth is a different substance than ice at the surface. It is denser. It has been compressed by the weight of everything above it, by the accumulated pressure of years folding into years, and this compression changes it in ways that are visible to certain instruments and invisible to the eye. There is a kind of ice that forms in glaciers, deep in the continental sheets, that is hundreds of thousands of years old. Scientists extract cores from it and read the air bubbles trapped inside, and the bubbles hold the atmosphere of a world that no longer exists. The composition of air from before human beings made enough noise to register in the geological record. The ice keeps what it finds. The ice is patient in a way that nothing alive can match. It simply holds and holds and holds until someone comes to ask it what it has been keeping. In this version of events, nobody comes. Or rather, the people who come find nothing, not because there is nothing to find, but because the geography of the search is wrong. The instruments are insufficiently precise, and the years accumulate faster than the searching does. The SSR's first attempt to locate the Valkyrie's wreckage in the summer of 1946 used sonar equipment calibrated for the Atlantic shipping lanes and found signals consistent with the debris of a large aircraft, scattered over a wide area of ocean floor. They logged it. They did not go deeper. The second attempt in 1952 was classified at a level that removed it from the institutional memory of the organization that ordered it, meaning that when SHIELD was formally constituted in 1955, no one who built the new agency knew that a search had already happened, and so no one thought to continue it. The bureaucracy of secrecy had consumed its own record of what it was looking for. By 1965, the position of the Valkyrie's wreck was a matter of inference rather than direct knowledge. A SHIELD analyst named Charlotte Everett produced a paper in that year, declassified in its entirety in 2018 as part of a broader historical review, that triangulated the probable impact zone using wind patterns, the trajectory of confirmed debris finds, and back calculations from Zola's captured flight logs. Everett's paper was right. Her coordinates were accurate to within 3 kilometers. The paper was filed in the SHIELD Intelligence Archive with a notation that read, "Awaiting resource allocation for deep water survey," and that notation sat there for another 47 years, collecting the particular silence of things waiting for attention that never arrives. And so Steve Rogers stayed in the ice. The ice kept him perfectly, in the sense that the cold slowed every biological process to near cessation, and the serum maintained what the cold preserved, and the combination of these two things produced a kind of stasis that was, in its strange and terrible way, exactly the form of life it most resembled. Suspension, not death, not life. The space between, held open by two things that should not have coexisted, the ice that should have killed him and the serum that would not let it, and the world above him went on without him, and he went on without the world, frozen in the moment of his last decision, the moment the plane's controls came alive under his hands, and he looked at what was ahead of him and made his choice. The world built its myth without him. This is what myths require sometimes, the absence of the person they are about, so that the person can be shaped into something more precise than any living human being actually is. Captain America became, in the years after 1945, a cleaner thing than Steve Rogers had ever been. The photographs survived. The newsreel footage survived. The testimony of the Howling Commandos, given in interviews across the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s, built a portrait of a man so consistent and so principled that he began to feel, to the people who had not known him, less like a historical figure and more like a figure of speech. The kind of phrase you use when you mean something that cannot be compromised, something that means what it says, something that holds its shape under pressure. Captain America came to mean that. Not a person, exactly. A standard. The difficulty with standards is that they cannot respond to the thing in front of them. They can only be met or not met, and this is a brittle form of guidance for a world that does not, on balance, present itself in ways that are easily evaluated against fixed criteria. The world that grew up after 1945 was not the world Steve Rogers had understood when he flew the plane into the ocean. The Cold War had a moral texture that defied the clean lines he had navigated. The civil rights movement confronted the country with the gap between its stated values and its actual practice, a gap that the Captain America mythology had papered over rather than addressed. Vietnam happened. Watergate happened. The optimistic post-war framework cracked, and then cracked again, and the icon that had been preserved in amber, unable to respond, unable to adjust, unable to do the most essentially human thing, which is to change your mind when the evidence requires it, could not help the cracking. Nick Fury, who had been with the Howling Commandos and who had come through the decades with his own particular combination of survival skills and moral complexity and tact, said something in a S.H.I.E.L.D. director's memo from 1978 that was flagged in a later internal review as unusually direct for official correspondence. The memo was addressed to a Congressional Oversight Committee and was responding to a proposal to use the Captain America image in a domestic recruitment campaign. Fury wrote, "We keep Steve Rogers in the archive because the archive is where he belongs, and I say that with respect. The archive is for things that cannot adapt. The world keeps moving. Steve does not." The committee rejected the recruitment campaign and quietly removed Fury's memo from the circulating record, and Fury, characteristically, had kept a copy. This is the emotional center of the divergence. In the version you know, Steve Rogers comes back, and the process of adaptation, painful, strange, honest, is the narrative. He has to learn the world. The world has to learn him again. The myth is confronted with the man, and the man is harder and more interesting and more complicated than the myth. And what comes from that confrontation is something richer than either the man or the myth alone could have produced. But in this version, that confrontation never happens. The myth is never disrupted by the person inside it. And so it calcifies, and it becomes something beautiful and inert, and the world that is trying to live up to it is trying to live up to an ideal that has no reference point in anything currently breathing. Somewhere in the cold water, in the dark, in the ice, Steve Rogers was still in the moment of his last decision. He had chosen the mission. He had brought the plane down. He had accepted what was coming with the same clarity he had accepted every other moment that asked more of him than he had to give. He was, in that moment, everything the myth said he was. Brave and certain and good in a way that did not require any complexity to express itself, because the moment was simple, and simplicity had always been Steve's element. He was made for the clear choice. He was made for the moment when everything reduces to a single question. What is the right thing to do here? And the answer, in that moment, was obvious. So he did it, and the ice took him, and he stayed. And in the east, in a cold room that smelled of antiseptic and metal, a man who had once been his best friend was being maintained in a different kind of stasis. Not the stasis of ice, but the stasis of conditioned obedience. The stasis of a mind that had been cleared and overwritten so many times that the clearing had become the default state. Bucky Barnes was not dead. He was not alive in the way that word implies continuity and choice and a thread of self that persists through time. He was suspended in the opposite way from Steve. Not held too cold, but held too carefully, too controlled, in a state of permanent operational readiness that foreclosed the very thing readiness is supposed to be for, acting on your own judgment. Two men in stasis, one in ice, one in conditioning, one unable to move, one unable to choose, one held by a physical force that did not distinguish between enemy and friend, one held by a social and psychological force that had spent decades ensuring that the distinction had been removed from him. They were, in their very different prisons, experiencing the same essential loss, the loss of time, of continuity, of the self as a thread that runs unbroken through the events of a life. And neither of them knew the other was still there. Steve could not know anything. Bucky had been made to forget. There is a kind of grief that has no object. The grief arrives, real and heavy, and reaches for the thing that caused it, and finds that the thing has been taken, not gone exactly, but removed from reach, placed somewhere the grief cannot follow. This is a particular kind of suffering that leaves people searching for what to attach the feeling to, what to do with the weight of it when there is no clear place to put it down. The world had this grief about Steve Rogers, and it learned to carry it through myth. Bucky Barnes had this grief about everything he had ever been, and he had been prevented from carrying it at all. The grief was there, the memory was gone. The grief remained, homeless, looking for somewhere to land. What survives systematic erasure is, it turns out, not what the people doing the erasing tend to target. They target the memories, because memories are how people locate themselves in time and relationship and meaning. They target the loyalties, because loyalties organize behavior and make behavior predictable to the people the subject once cared about. They target the name because the name is the point at which the self anchors to the social world, the place where you and the people who love you meet. All of these things in Bucky Barnes were targeted and largely dismantled. What was not targeted, because it was not visible, because it operated below the level of explicit memory or declared loyalty or named identity, was the body's knowledge of what care felt like. The cellular record of having been loved, the way a person moves when they have spent years moving alongside someone they trusted absolutely, when trust has been deposited in the muscles and the reflex arcs and the instinct that reaches out toward the familiar before the conscious mind has finished its calculation. This is what the Hydra scientists missed, not through negligence, they were thorough, but through a limitation of their model. They understood the mind as memory and directive. They did not understand the body as a second kind of archive, one that kept a different record in a different language, one that could not be wiped because it was not stored the way they knew to look for storage. Bucky Barnes kept remembering things he did not know he was remembering. The intrusive subroutines, the calibration problem, the thing that kept pushing through the architecture of what had been built over him. It was not memory in the form the scientists were monitoring for. It was something older and more stubborn. It was the knowledge, carried in nerve and reflex and the inarticulate intelligence of a body that has lived through things, that this was not what he was for. In this alternate world, Steve Rogers stayed in the ice. But the ice is not the end of anything. It is a pause. It is the held breath between what was and what will eventually have to be, and the breath can only hold so long before the body insists on drawing the next one. Something was about to insist. Something that had been patient for a very long time was about to run out of patience. Cities at night, seen from a height, look like something natural, like bioluminescence, like the patterns that form on the underside of ice when light pushes through from above. From a rooftop in Moscow in 1967, the city spreads out below in that way, amber and white, irregular, the lights of apartments and offices and street lamps making a geography of their own that is different from the map but no less real. From that height, the city breathes. You can feel it the way you feel the sea from a cliff, the scale of it, the accumulated life, the particular way that large collections of human beings give off warmth. From that height, alone on a rooftop with a suppressed rifle and a set of coordinates and a name that meant nothing to him, the Winter Soldier was not watching the city breathe. He was waiting for a window to illuminate on the 4th floor of a building 300 meters away, and when it did, he would complete his assignment. The operational record for that night, a SHIELD document designated WS-1967R, recovered during the Lemurian Star incident and cross-referenced with known Hydra directive files in 2014, describes the mission in 12 words: asset deployment, Moscow, elimination of target Petrov Anatoly, assignment complete, exfil confirmed. 12 words. For a man's life, for what it cost to take it, for whatever James Barnes saw when he looked through the scope and found the face of the man he had been sent to kill, and completed the assignment because the assignment was all he had, and then was extracted and returned to storage, and the 12 words went into the file, and the file went into the archive, and the archive accumulated the records of every other assignment with the same clipped indifference to what any of it meant. There were, by the SHIELD analysis completed in 2014, 17 confirmed eliminations across the Winter Soldier's operational period from 1953 to 2011. 17 is almost certainly an undercount. The Hydra files were incomplete, many were destroyed as Hydra cells were dismantled, and some operations were conducted without documentation as a deliberate security measure. The actual number is probably higher. Each one represents a life, and represents also a cost to the person who ended it, though that person was not permitted to register the cost in any way that would accumulate into something he could name, or acknowledge, or carry. The cost was always there. It was being stored somewhere the scientists were not looking. The Winter Soldier program was, by any metric its designers would have accepted, a success. Hydra's investment in the asset's development, the technology, the time, the resources devoted to the mnemonic suppression protocol, yielded decades of operational capability that no conventional intelligence service could have matched. The asset was precise. He was reliable. He was deployable anywhere without a support structure. He required no cover story because he had no story of his own to maintain. He was, in the language the designers used, frictionless. The thing that made agents detectable, the weight of their own history, the attachments and loyalties and behavioral patterns that surveillance could identify and exploit, was absent in him. He moved through the world without leaving a trace, and the world moved through him without finding a foothold. He was frictionless. He was perfect. He was entirely alone inside his own skull in a way that no human being is designed to sustain. What the program could not prevent, despite its sophistication, was the accumulation of sensory experience. Every mission deposited something in him that was not strictly operational. The smell of particular cities, the way rain sounds on different surfaces, cobblestone, asphalt, corrugated metal, the canvas of a military tent, the texture of cold metal under his right hand, the real one, the one that had nerve endings and could tell the difference between surfaces. These things were not memories exactly. They were not attached to context or to any sense of what had happened in which city, in what year, for what reason. They were impressions, the way sediment is an impression of the water that moved through it. He was accumulating the negative space of a life, not the events, which were suppressed, but the sensory residue that the events left behind. There is a mission in 1979 described in a Hydra handler's log recovered from a storage facility in Hungary in 2016 that is notable for a reason the handler clearly did not intend to record as notable. The log describes a standard exfiltration after a completed assignment in Berlin. The asset is being escorted back to the extraction vehicle. The handler notes, in what appears to be a routine observation, that the asset paused without instruction in front of a building on Unter den Linden and stood there for approximately 40 seconds before responding to the handler's directive to move. The handler noted the pause as a possible malfunction and logged it for review by the scientific team. The scientific team reviewed it and found nothing actionable. The pause was classified as unexplained and filed. The building on Unter den Linden was a small bakery. It was closed at the hour the asset passed it, but the building's ventilation ran at night, and the smell of the previous day's bread lingered in the cold air around it. A very specific smell, the smell of rye and warm yeast, old and familiar in a way that has nothing to do with any specific memory of bread, but with the way certain smells carry the emotional atmosphere of an entire period of a life, the way smell bypasses the conscious mind and goes straight to whatever part of the brain keeps the things the conscious mind has been told to forget. He stood in front of that bakery for 40 seconds. The handler thought it was a malfunction. It was the opposite of malfunction. It was the closest thing to James Barnes that the Winter Soldier had been in 34 years. In this alternate timeline, S.H.I.E.L.'s awareness of the Winter Soldier program developed differently than in the version you know. Without Steve Rogers' return to provide the catalyst, in the version you know, it is Steve's presence and the events surrounding Project Insight that finally bring the program to light. S.H.I.E.L.'s intelligence on the asset remained fragmentary and contested. A pattern of incidents, clearly connected when you knew what you were looking for, that remained unconnected when the institutional knowledge to connect them was absent. Nick Fury had a file. He had been building it for 20 years, cross-referencing incident reports with a persistence that his analyst found, variously, admirable and alarming. The file was thin on confirmed facts and thick with inference, but Fury trusted inference. He had survived by trusting inference, by acting on the pattern before the pattern was complete, and the pattern in this file pointed to something he had been avoiding naming for longer than he was comfortable admitting. He named it in a memo to himself. He had a habit of writing memos to himself as a way of forcing clarity in the spring of 2010. The memo began, "If the asset is who I think the asset is, then we have a problem that has nothing to do with operational security and everything to do with what we owe the dead." He did not send the memo to anyone. He filed it in his personal archive under a designation that was not searchable by the S.H.I.E.L.D. system. He was not ready yet for the implications, but naming it, even privately, changed something. The memo sat in his personal archive like a charge waiting for the right circuit to complete it. The world had forgotten James Buchanan Barnes. This is a straightforward historical fact, and it requires some qualification to fully understand. It is not that no one remembered him. The historians of World War II remembered him. The archivists who maintained the SSR records remembered him, the veterans who had served alongside him, and who were, by the 2010s, very old and very few and very conscious of what they were. The last holders have remembered him with a vividness that only the people who were actually there can achieve, which is to say in the texture and the smell and the weight of specific moments, rather than in the organized narratives that archives preserve. The Howling Commandos remembered him. Dum-Dum Dugan, until his death in 1998, kept a photograph in his wallet, a snapshot from a training camp in England, summer 1943. Bucky leaning against a fence post with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that Dugan described in his oral history, recorded 3 years before he died, as the look of a man who knows exactly how ridiculous the situation is but is going to see it through anyway. Dugan said, in that oral history, something that would have struck the people who heard it as sentimental, and would have been correct anyway. If Steve had been the conscience of that unit, then Bucky had been the common sense, and you need both things to get through a war, and Steve got a memorial, and Bucky got a plaque that almost no one visits, and that seems about right for the way the world distributes its attention. But it does not seem right as a matter of justice, and I have never made my peace with it, and I do not intend to. He was 84 when he said this. He died 6 months later. The oral history was archived at the SSR Museum in Washington, in a collection that received approximately 200 visitors a year. The man who was no longer Bucky Barnes, who was in 2010 being maintained in a Hydra facility in the Siberian highlands, did not know about the photograph in Dugan's wallet. He did not know about the oral history. He did not know that there was a plaque with his name on it in a small museum in Washington, or that the name on the plaque was also, somewhere deeper than the conditioning could reach, his name. He did not know that Nick Fury had a memo in a personal archive with his designation on it. He did not know that anything from before the fall still existed, that any part of the world he had once moved through still held a record of his having been there, still maintained some trace of the person he had been before the mountain and the cold and the 70 years in the dark. He did not know, but something in him, in the part the scientist had missed and the handlers had misfiled, was looking for exactly this, the confirmation that something had been left behind, that there was a B4 to get back to, that the erasure, however thorough, had not been total. He did not know what he was looking for. He only knew the shape of the absence it would fill. What the operational record cannot fully convey, what the 12-word entries and the efficiency ratings and the handler's logs describe without illuminating, is the specific texture of existing as the Winter Soldier, not the missions, which were discrete events with beginnings and ends and measurable parameters. The texture of the in-between, the not mission state, the periods of standby that the program used to manage the asset between deployments. These periods are barely documented in the operational files, because from the program's perspective they were operationally irrelevant. They were the time when the weapon was stored, and stored weapons do not generate records. But they were not irrelevant to the person inside them. A psychologist engaged by S.H.I.E.L.D. in 2015 to review the available behavioral data from the Winter Soldier program's maintenance logs, Dr. Eleni Vasquez, whose assessment report became a foundational document in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s emerging framework for understanding the long-term effects of identity destruction programs, wrote that the most striking finding in the maintenance records was not the evidence of memory persistence or subroutine intrusion, though both were significant. The most striking finding was the frequency with which the logs recorded what the handlers characterized as non-purposive behavior during standby periods. The asset looking at things or sitting in particular orientations or making small repetitive physical movements with no apparent operational function. Vasquez's interpretation of this pattern was careful and measured, as her interpretations always were, but it amounted to this. The program had not been able to prevent the asset from having interiority. It had removed the content of that interiority, the memories, the relationships, the sense of purpose and history that give interiority its structure. But the capacity for it, the basic orientation toward having an inner life, was something that resisted the technology available to the Hydra scientists of that period. He had not been reduced to a mechanism. He had been reduced to a person who had been stripped of almost everything that makes a person legible to themselves and to others, but who remained, in that stripped state, still fundamentally a person, still inside his own experience, still, however dimly and without any adequate framework for understanding it, there. The cryo unit was the element of the program that the Hydra files describe most extensively, because it was the most technically demanding component and the most logistically significant. The asset was maintained in suspension for periods ranging from several weeks to several years, depending on operational tempo and the assessed risk of subroutine intrusion in active memory. The files describe the process of reactivation following suspension with a clinical detail that is retrospectively horrifying. The warming protocols, the physiological monitoring, the assessment sequence, and then what the files call orientation reconfirmation. The process of ensuring that the mnemonic suppression had held through the suspension period, that the identity architecture was intact, that the asset was operational. Reactivation apparently required between 4 and 72 hours, depending on suspension duration. During that window, the files note consistently, the asset was unresponsive to direct instruction, but showed signs of autonomic neurological activity inconsistent with full suspension. In plain language, during the thaw, something was happening. What was happening the scientists did not know or did not record. The files stop at the boundary of what they considered worth knowing, which was whether the asset would be ready when they needed him. What happened to James Barnes during those hours of coming back to the surface, what the mind does when it is returning from somewhere it was sent to protect itself from understanding, is not in any file and belongs entirely to him. What nobody understood yet, not Fury, not the Hydra scientists, not the handlers in Siberia, was that the longest missions are never the ones ordered from outside. The longest mission the Winter Soldier would ever run was the one he had already started without knowing it, the mission back to himself. Memory does not return all at once. Anyone who has tried to recall something long forgotten, a childhood room, a face from a decade ago, the lyrics of a song you have not thought of in years, knows that memory arrives in fragments, each one isolated and slightly puzzling until enough of them accumulate to suggest the shape of the whole. It arrives in the smell of something, or the particular quality of a light, or the feel of a texture under your fingers, and it arrives before the conscious mind has caught up, so that for a moment you are experiencing something that makes no sense in the context of where you are. And then the context shifts, and the fragment finds its place, and a small piece of what was lost comes back to where it belongs. This is how remembering works. It is slow. It is non-linear. It does not respect the urgency of the person trying to do it. It proceeds at its own pace, in the dark, finding its way by sense rather than by logic. In the autumn of 2011, a Hydra handler stationed at the Siberian facility recorded an incident in the asset's maintenance log that was categorized as anomalous and escalated to the facility's lead scientist. The incident was this. Following a routine calibration session, the euphemism for the recalibration of the mnemonic suppression protocol, which was performed every 6 to 8 months to counteract the subroutine intrusions. The asset was returned to quarters, and the handler performed the standard 30-minute observation window. During the observation window, the asset sat on the edge of his bunk and did not move for 22 minutes. This was not in itself unusual. The period immediately following calibration often produced a temporary suspension of activity as the system restabilized. What was unusual was that at minute 23, the handler observed the asset's right hand moving, not in response to any stimulus, not in execution of any directive. The hand opened and closed slowly 3 times and then was still. When the handler asked the asset to report status, the asset reported nominal. The hand movement was logged as involuntary motor activity, possibly residual from the calibration process. It was not residual from the calibration process. In the 1930s and 1940s, James Barnes had a habit, noted by Steve Rogers in a letter to his mother that is preserved in the SSR archive, of opening and closing his right hand when he was thinking through a problem. Not a nervous gesture, a deliberate one, a way of keeping the body occupied while the mind worked, of grounding himself in the physical while the cognitive processed. Steve noticed it because he noticed everything about Bucky that he could notice, the way people notice things about the people they love that the people in question do not know about themselves. The hand movement was Bucky thinking. It was Bucky trying to work something out. The calibration process had, in whatever oblique way the body's knowledge works, triggered it. Something in the system was doing exactly what the handler had noted. It was processing. It was trying to get to the other side of something. What he was processing, as best as can be reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence, was a question. Not a question he could articulate. Not yet, not in words that had the specificity of language, but a question in the way that a wound is a question, in the way that an ache is a question, in the way that the feeling of absence is a question about what was once present. Something was missing. Something had been there and was gone, and the missing of it had no name and no face and no context, but it had weight and dimension, and he could feel the shape of it even without knowing what had made the shape. He was asking, in the only language currently available to him, what was I? The recovery process, in the version of events that followed, was not the version the world would write about in the years to come. The world would want a dramatic catalyst, an inciting incident, a confrontation, a face from the past that broke the conditioning open. In the version you know, it is Steve's face. It is the person who knew him best finding him and refusing to fight back and saying his name, and the name doing the work that names do when they are spoken by the right person. But in this world, there is no Steve to find him. There is no face from the past that has remained in the present. The people who knew him are mostly dead. The catalyst, when it comes, is not dramatic. It is small. It is so small that if it had not been the very specific thing that it was, it would not have been enough. In the winter of 2012, the asset was deployed on a mission to Bucharest, a surveillance assignment that the handler classified as low risk. The city in winter has a particular quality. Not beautiful exactly, but inhabited in the way that certain Central European cities are inhabited. The weight of history in the buildings and the particular way people move through cold streets, when the cold is familiar rather than surprising. The assignment required the asset to maintain surveillance of a low-level target at a market near the city centre. The market sold produce and second-hand goods, and hot drinks from a cart near the entrance. The asset positioned himself at a vantage point and waited, and the waiting was what it always was, which is nothing, no duration, no texture, no boredom or impatience, simply a state of operational readiness that persisted until it was no longer required. There was a boy at the market, perhaps 8 years old, perhaps 9. He was buying something at a fruit stall, and the transaction was taking longer than it should have because the boy was short the correct money and was negotiating. With the particular combination of earnestness and tactical creativity that children deploy when they want something and do not have quite enough of what it costs. The man at the stall was losing patience. The boy was not. The boy was persistent in the way that small people learn to be persistent when the world is not sized for them, when the world keeps presenting obstacles calibrated for people larger and older and better provisioned, and the only viable response is to find a way through anyway, to keep pushing until the gap opens. The asset watched this transaction from his position, 70 meters away, with no directive to observe it, and no operational relevance to account for his attention being there rather than on the target. And yet his attention was there. It remained there for the full duration of the negotiation, which lasted 4 minutes and ended with the fruit seller relenting and accepting what the boy had, which was not quite enough. The boy walked away with his purchase, an apple it appeared to be, and the asset tracked him for another 30 seconds before the operational directive reasserted itself and the attention returned to where it was supposed to be. He could not have said what it was about the boy. He could not have said what it was about that transaction, or that particular quality of small person persistence that pulled his attention and held it in a way that nothing in his operational context should have been able to do. But something in him recognized something in the boy, and the recognition was not conscious and could not be located or examined, but it was real, and it left something behind, a residue, like the smell of the bakery in Berlin, like the hand opening and closing 3 times in the Siberian facility, an impression, a ghost of a shape that had once been something. The recovery, when it began in earnest, was initiated by Bucky Barnes himself. This is the most important fact about it, and the one that the versions of the story that want a more dramatic catalyst tend to minimize. In 2013, the asset completed a mission in Prague and, during the extraction window, did not proceed to the extraction point. He missed the window deliberately, or, at least, in a manner consistent with deliberateness, in a manner that suggests the operational directive was received, and the choice was made not to follow it. The Hydra file on this incident is brief and classified under the heading Asset Anomaly, Unauthorized Deviation. What the file does not contain is what happened between the mission's completion and the missed extraction. 2 hours in which the asset sat in a small park near the river and did nothing, not waiting for new instructions, not executing any operational function, sitting, watching the river, being still in a way that operational stillness is not still, not the stillness of readiness, but the stillness of someone who has stopped moving in order to listen for something. He went to ground after Prague. This is not the precise language for it. Going to ground implies concealment from a known threat, and what he was doing was more fundamental than that. But it is the closest available phrase. He stopped completing missions. He stopped responding to the handler's contact protocols. He found a room in a city that is identified in the subsequent Hydra search file only as a Central European metropolitan area, and he remained in that room, and he waited for himself to come back to him. He did not know that was what he was waiting for. He had no framework for understanding what was happening in the space the conditioning had occupied, the way the conditioning's grip was loosening the way ice loosens in spring, not dramatically, not all at once, but at the edges first, the thinnest places first, the places where the melt had been working longest. He did not know what would be underneath when the ice was gone. He did not know if there was a self to recover or only a shape where one had been. But he waited, in that room, in that city, with the particular patience of someone who has been patient for so long that patience has become indistinguishable from the texture of existence. The most extraordinary thing about what James Barnes did in that room, in that city, in the months between 2013 and 2014, is that he did it without a map. He had no framework for self-recovery. He had no therapist, no support structure, no predecessor to tell him how it was supposed to go. He had the body's knowledge of how it felt to move through the world without constant direction, and the incomplete fragments of something that was not yet memory, but was moving in that direction, and the patience of a person who had been in worse situations and found, somehow, the way through them, though he could not remember which situations or what the way through had looked like, only that the finding had happened, that the through existed, that arriving on the other side of something terrible was a thing that had been done before. He was working from nothing but the ghost of his own capability. He was, in a very real sense, trusting himself before he knew who he was. That trust, that foundational, evidence-free, almost irrational willingness to proceed on the assumption that there was something worth recovering, is the thing the story of Bucky Barnes keeps returning to, in different forms, at different moments, because it is the center of what he is. Not strength, not skill, not the tactical brilliance or the physical capability or the decades of weaponized expertise. Those are all real and all consequential, but they are not the thing. The thing is this: he keeps going. When everything has been taken from him, when the architecture of identity has been systematically dismantled, when there is no external reference point or guiding relationship or remembered purpose to anchor him, he keeps going. Not because he knows where he is going, because stopping is a kind of death he has decided not to accept. In a world where Steve Rogers never came back, Bucky Barnes came back alone. No witness to the process, no hand extended across a decade of ice and memory. Just a man in a room, in a city, finding the edges of himself in the dark and following them back to the center. He did not know yet what he would find when he got there. He did not know yet that the world was waiting for someone to pick up something very heavy. But he was getting closer to knowing, and the world, whether it was aware of it or not, was getting closer to needing him to. In a basement level of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, in a climate-controlled storage vault that maintains a constant temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity of 45%, there is a display case containing a vibranium steel alloy shield. The case has a security classification above what most of the museum's staff are cleared for, which is the polite version of saying that most of the people who work in the building do not know the shield is there. It sits in the dark when the vault is unoccupied, which is most of the time. The surface is clean, maintained with the same regularity that a museum applies to objects of significant historical value, which this object is, and then some. The red and white and blue of it are still vivid. The star at the center is still precise. It is in perfect condition by any technical measure. It has not been used in 70 years, and it shows. The question of what to do with Steve Rogers' shield was a matter of ongoing institutional and political debate from 1946 through the first decade of the 21st century. It was not a simple question, and the people who engaged with it seriously, as opposed to the people who engaged with it performatively, who were numerous and loud and who wanted the shield to mean what they needed it to mean for various purposes that had little to do with Steve Rogers, understood this. The shield was not just an object. It had been made from a material that existed nowhere else on Earth, by a metallurgist whose methods could not be replicated, for a man who had used it with a skill that was itself non-reproducible. It was in every meaningful sense unique, and uniqueness creates a problem when the unique thing is also a symbol. The symbol wants to be used, and the using inevitably changes what the unique thing is. Howard Stark, who had made the shield and who had spent considerable energy over the years after 1945 trying and failing to reproduce either the material or the process, wrote a memo in 1952 that addressed this question with the directness that characterized his better professional work. The memo argued that the shield should be placed in long-term archival storage, removed from both display and operational consideration, on the grounds that using it without the man it was made for would be a misuse that would degrade rather than honor what it represented. He wrote, "It was designed for someone who moved in a specific way, with a specific set of physical capabilities and a specific set of instincts that no one else has. Giving it to someone else is not a legacy. It is a costume, and I have made enough costumes in my career to know the difference." The memo was received, debated, and eventually acted upon, though the debate took 11 years and several unsuccessful proposals to commission a replacement. By the time the Avengers Initiative was formalized in 2011, in this alternate timeline, the initiative's composition and timing were somewhat different from the version you know, shaped by the absence of Steve Rogers and by the choices Nick Fury made in the decades of building toward it. The shield had been in archival storage for the better part of 6 decades. Its existence was classified at a level that kept it out of public awareness, which meant that the public mythology of Captain America was maintained through photographs and film footage and the museum exhibition that the Smithsonian curated with care. But the most potent physical artifact of that mythology was sitting in a vault that most of the country's decision-makers did not know existed. The people who did know it existed were divided on the question with an intensity that surprised people who expected them to be rational about it. Tony Stark, Howard's son, now running Stark Industries and also running the Iron Man program and also serving as the unofficial scientist-in-residence for the Avengers Initiative, a combination of roles that kept him occupied at a level he described as pleasantly insane, had a position on the shield that was straightforwardly pragmatic and privately more complicated than he let on. The pragmatic position was that the shield should either be deployed or decommissioned, because leaving a unique weapon in storage was a waste of resources. The private complication was that the shield carried his father's work and his father's memory of Steve Rogers, and Tony's relationship with both of those things was not something he could be straightforward about under ordinary circumstances, let alone in the context of an argument about military policy. Sam Wilson, who had been recruited into the Avengers program through a channel involving a conversation with Fury that Sam had described in a later interview as the most disorienting 17 minutes of his life, had a position that was less pragmatic and more categorical. The shield was Steve Rogers's. It had been used by Steve Rogers, and deploying it without Steve Rogers was a form of impersonation that cheapened what it stood for. He was not opposed to a Captain America. He thought the world needed what Captain America represented, and he thought he might eventually be the person who could provide it. But he was opposed to the shield specifically, for Steve specifically, being deployed by anyone who was not Steve. He held this position with the particular intensity of someone who has thought about it from the inside rather than the outside, who has imagined being the one who carries the thing and has imagined, in detail, what that would cost. Fury had a third position. He held it quietly, as he held most things that mattered to him, and he shared it with almost no one, because the position depended on information that he had not shared with almost anyone and was not yet ready to share. His position was that the question of who should carry the shield was irrelevant until they had answered the prior question, which was, what had happened to the man who fell from the train before Steve went into the ice? Because if Fury's inference was correct, if the Winter Soldier operational profile matched what he'd been reluctantly suspecting for 15 years, then the shield question was not a policy question at all. It was a question of justice, and justice had a direction that was already pointing somewhere specific. The Avengers in this timeline were a different formation from the one you know. The anchoring figure, the one who provided the moral and tactical center that Steve Rogers had provided in the version you know, was absent, and the absence had shaped everything about how the team had formed and what it had built and what it was still missing. Tony's capability and intelligence were indisputable and had been the operational spine of a dozen successful engagements. But Tony was not the kind of person who could be the center of something that asked more of its center than competence and cleverness. He was too aware of the cost of things, too honestly cynical about the gap between what people said they stood for and what they actually did, to occupy the role that Steve had occupied, the role of simply undemonstrably believing. Thor had a form of that belief, but it was calibrated to a different cosmos. And Natasha Romanoff had capabilities that were breathtaking and an emotional history that made straightforward belief in things she had been given plenty of reasons not to believe in a more complicated proposition. The team was good. In the years between the initiative's formal beginning and the events that would eventually change everything, the Avengers achieved outcomes that justified the enormous investment of resources and political capital that their existence required. They were good at the work, but there was something hollow in the center of them, a resonance frequency they were not quite hitting, a note that would have resolved the chord they were playing and that was persistently absent. Fury could hear it. He had been hearing it for years. He had stopped expecting to know what would fill it, and then the information about the Winter Soldier had begun to accumulate in his private archive, and the possibility that the hollow center and the missing person were related had begun to feel less like a hope and more like a hypothesis. In 2014, two things happened in close enough succession that even if they were coincidental, which Fury did not believe, they would have forced the question. The first was a Hydra cell in Eastern Europe going dark in an unusual way. Not destroyed, not gone to ground, but abandoned. Equipment left in place, personnel vanished, operational files partially wiped in a way that suggested disruption from within rather than from an external source. The Hydra cell in question was one of the cells that Fury had tentatively linked to the Winter Soldier program, and its sudden abandonment, in a way consistent with the asset removing himself from the system rather than being removed by outside force, was exactly the kind of event his memo had been waiting for. The second thing was a report from a SHIELD field operative in Romania that described a chance encounter with an unidentified man in Bucharest who appeared to be living rough, who had a metal arm, and who had declined to engage when the operative identified themselves but had not threatened, had not fled, had simply watched from across the street with an expression the operative described as recognition without certainty. Recognition without certainty. Fury read that phrase 3 times. He put the field report in his personal archive next to the memo he had written to himself in 2010. He looked at the 2 documents for a long time. Then he made a call to a secure line that he had maintained for 14 years without using it. And when the person on the other end answered, he said 4 words. "I think I know." The shield in the vault did not move that day, or the next, or for several months after. But the conversation around it shifted. Something that had been a policy question became something else. Something that had the weight of a person attached to it. A real person with a real history. Not the idealized image on the wall of the museum, but someone who had been through things the museum did not have the language to display. The vault that housed the shield was climate-controlled and secure, and the shield was in perfect condition, and it was waiting in the way that things wait when they have been built for a purpose that has not yet been met. The Oversight Committee's handling of the shield question across the decades between 1946 and 2014 produced a documentary trail that, viewed retrospectively, reveals the degree to which institutional caution can accumulate into a kind of institutional paralysis, a state in which the decision not to decide becomes, itself, a decision with consequences. Every committee that considered the shield found reasons to defer. The operational risks of misuse, the symbolic risks of diminishment, the political risks of appearing to replace the irreplaceable. Every deferral was defensible. The accumulated deferrals produced a situation in which a weapon of unique capability sat unused for nearly 7 decades, while the world it had been made to protect changed in ways that made its absence felt, in each successive generation differently, but always felt. Sam Wilson's position on the shield question deserves more careful examination than the summary version offers. He was not simply sentimental about Steve Rogers, or rather, he was sentimental, but the sentiment was grounded in something analytical. He had thought carefully about what the Captain America figure did psychologically for the people it was meant to serve, and his conclusion was that the figure worked, when it worked, because it was coherent. The physical presentation and the moral content and the operational practice were all pointing in the same direction, all saying the same thing in different registers. The shield, the uniform, the face above the uniform, the decisions that face made in the field, these things formed a complete system, and the system's coherence was its power. His concern about someone other than Steve carrying the shield was not about loyalty to Steve's memory. It was about the risk of incoherence, of the system's elements no longer pointing in the same direction, of the physical presentation saying one thing and the person inside it being something the symbol had not prepared anyone to process. What Wilson could not have anticipated when he articulated this concern was the way that Bucky Barnes would resolve the incoherence problem. He would resolve it not by becoming coherent with the original system, not by becoming, in some way, Steve-like, but by being coherent with something different, himself. The incoherence that Wilson had worried about, the gap between the symbol and the person, did not materialize in the way he had feared, because Barnes did not try to close that gap from the symbol's side. He did not try to be what the symbol was. He let the symbol be what it was, and he was what he was, and the gap between those things became the most honest part of what he offered. The visible acknowledgement that Captain America and James Barnes were not the same thing, and that this was not a failure of fit but the truth of the moment. The world was not 1941. The symbol was not going to be what it had been. The most honest version of the symbol for this moment was one that bore the marks of what the world had done since 1941, and there was no one more visibly, more indelibly marked than James Barnes. The question was not whether someone would carry the shield. The question was whether the person it was waiting for would believe, when the time came, that the shield was not too heavy for someone who had already been carrying something heavier for 70 years. Early morning in Washington has a specific quality in the weeks between seasons, when autumn has finished its work and winter has not yet fully committed to its own. The air is still, and the light when it comes is low and unhurried, arriving at an angle that makes the monuments look as though they are slowly emerging from something, rather than simply standing in their fixed positions. The mall at that hour is almost empty. The people who use it in the early hours are joggers and dog walkers, and the occasional person sitting on a bench with the particular posture of someone thinking through something they cannot think through indoors. At that hour the Washington Monument casts a long shadow across the grass, and the shadow moves so slowly that if you watch it carefully, you can almost convince yourself it is not moving at all. James Barnes. He was practicing using the name, had been practicing it for several months, in the quiet of the apartment that S.H.I.E.L.D. had provided through Fury's arrangement, in the way you practice something that you know intellectually to be yours, but that does not yet feel fully inhabited. Came to Washington in the late autumn of 2014 and spent 3 weeks in that apartment before he agreed to meet with anyone. Fury had not pushed. This was, for Fury, a remarkable exercise of restraint, because the situation was pressing in ways that made restraint costly, and Fury did not like paying costs he could avoid. But he had looked at what the field report said, and at what the Hydra files implied, and at the assessment prepared by the S.H.I.E.L.D. psychologist who had reviewed the available behavioral data, and the assessment was consistent. Pressure at this stage would close rather than open the thing they were trying to open. They had to wait for him to be ready. They waited. The first meeting was with Fury alone. This was also Fury's judgment rather than a committee decision, and the committee, the oversight group that existed above the Avengers Initiative, the collection of political and military principals who had jurisdiction over things like this, was not pleased about being excluded, but they had long since learned that Fury's judgment on things like this was better than theirs, and so they expressed displeasure in the appropriate channels and then did not interfere. Fury met Barnes in the apartment. He brought coffee. He sat across a small table from a man who had been mythologized and destroyed and rebuilt, and was now in the process of rebuilding himself from the inside. A man who looked at him with eyes that were still doing the kind of rapid assessment that the SSR had noted in the 1943 file as an unusual reliability of tactical intuition, though the eyes also had behind them the quality that Fury associated with people who had been through specific kinds of darkness, not haunted exactly, but weighted, the way eyes are weighted when they have held things that do not resolve cleanly. Fury told him everything he knew. He told it plainly, without softening and without dramatizing, in the way that he had learned to deliver difficult information, direct, complete, without the editorial overlays that people tend to add when they are managing someone's reaction, rather than respecting their capacity to process the truth. Barnes listened. He did not ask many questions. The ones he asked were precise, and they were the questions of someone who was confirming a shape he had already been working toward, rather than encountering the information for the first time. He had been piecing it together, the fragments, the impressions, the body's knowledge, for months. Fury's information did not shock him. It confirmed what he had suspected, and the confirmation was almost a relief, the way naming a thing you've been afraid of is almost a relief, because the unnamed fear is always larger than the named one. He asked about Steve. This was the question Fury had been dreading, and he answered it the same way he answered everything else. directly, plainly, without comfort. He told Barnes that Steve Rogers had gone into the ice in April 1945 and had not come back. He told him that the ice was still there, that the search had been ongoing sporadically and without success for decades. He told him that Steve was not dead by any evidence they had, but that not dead and accessible were not the same thing, and the accessible part was the problem, and they had not solved it. Barnes received this in a silence that lasted long enough that Fury began to count it, and he stopped counting at approximately 45 seconds. Then Barnes said, in a voice that was quiet and even and not quite steady, "I knew." And then he did not say anything else about it for the rest of the meeting. The question of the shield was not raised at the first meeting, or the second, or the third. The question of the shield was raised eventually by Barnes himself in the fourth meeting, in a way that suggested he had been thinking about it since the beginning and was only now prepared to think about it out loud. He did not ask to carry it. He asked what had been done with it, and Fury told him, and Barnes was quiet for a moment in that way he had, that 45-second way, and then he said, "Howard made that shield to move the way Steve moved. It doesn't move that way for anyone else." He was right. This had been demonstrated twice in classified tests conducted in the 1980s and again in the late 1990s, when SHIELD had experimented with deploying the shield with trained operatives to evaluate whether it retained practical tactical utility without its original user. Both trials had concluded that the shield was theoretically capable of the same functions: the deflection, the throwing trajectory, the kinetic properties, but that in practice, without the specific physical profile and trained movement vocabulary that Steve Rogers had developed over years of use, the weapon was dramatically less effective. It was not the object, it was the person, or rather it was the object and the person as a single system, inseparable, each calibrated to the other. The shield without Steve was a remarkable piece of engineering and a hollow symbol. It was a hammer without the hand that knew how to use it. Barnes said, "I'm not Steve." This was also not a question. Fury said, "No." Barnes said, "The shield was made for him." Fury said, "Yes." Barnes said, "So anything I do with it is going to be something else." Fury said, "That's true." And then, because it was the thing that needed to be said, and Fury was not good at letting necessary things go unsaid for longer than he could help. But the world needs a Captain America, and you're what we have, and the question isn't whether you're Steve. The question is whether you're the best possible thing given what we're working with. Barnes looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know if I am." Fury said, "Nobody knows that in advance. That's always been the problem with the job. The decision to accept the shield was not a dramatic moment. This is worth noting, because the mythology that accumulated around it afterward wanted it to be dramatic, wanted a speech, a ceremony, a visible transformation of the kind that stories require to mark the turning point clearly. What actually happened, according to Fury's personal log from that period, was that Barnes came to the shield facility one morning in November 2014, asked to see the shield, and stood in front of the display case in the archival vault for a period of time that Fury's log records as approximately 12 minutes. He didn't say anything during those 12 minutes. He looked at the shield the way a person looks at something they have a complicated history with, which is different from the way a person looks at something they want, and different again from the way a person looks at something they are afraid of, though it contained elements of both. Then he said, quietly and to no one in particular, "Okay," and he picked it up. The first time he held it wrong. This is documented in the training assessment that accompanied the first week of operational preparation, a clinical document that attempts to describe, with the detachment of professional evaluation, the process of a man who was simultaneously one of the most skilled combat operatives alive and completely unprepared for the specific demands of this specific tool. The shield has a particular technique for throwing and recovering that is not intuitive, that does not follow from any other weapons discipline, that is entirely its own vocabulary. Steve had developed that vocabulary over years, beginning before the serum when his throwing distance was limited and his recovery window was narrow, and the serum had then amplified a technique that was already refined. Barnes had no such foundation. He had a different set of physical capabilities, enhanced by the serum fragments that Hydra's work had introduced into his system, and he had decades of different weapons training, and none of it transferred. He started again. This was the most revealing thing about him in those first weeks. Not the difficulty, not the wrong-held shield, not the throws that went off angle, and the recoveries that required more adjustment than they should have. It was the willingness to start again. He failed repeatedly, systematically, without the kind of frustration that failure usually generates in highly capable people who are not accustomed to it. He failed and adjusted and failed slightly differently and adjusted again, with the patience of someone who understood from somewhere very deep in himself that the way through a hard thing was not to want it to be easier, but to get better at handling the hardness. He was not performing stoicism. He was actually this way. The Hydra conditioning had aimed to produce this quality in him, and had instead found and preserved the quality that was already there, the basic Barnes disposition towards sustained effort in the absence of obvious progress. There is a difference between bearing the symbol of a thing and being the thing the symbol is trying to point to. The world would debate in the years to come whether Bucky Barnes wearing the shield was an honor or an imposition, a continuation or an imitation. The world would have this debate loudly and at length, which was the world's prerogative and its habit. But the debate missed the question that mattered. The question was not whether he was the right Captain America. The question was what Captain America was actually for, what the symbol was pointing to, what the original thing behind the image had ever been. Steve Rogers had not been the symbol. He had been a man who did the work. And the man who was now picking up the shield, in that vault, in that November morning light, understood work. He understood the kind of work that doesn't end, the kind that doesn't redeem itself in a single moment but accumulates, slowly, in the direction of something better. He understood it the way you understand things you have lived through rather than things you have been told about. The shield was a symbol. He was going to try to do the work. The training assessment from Barnes's first weeks of shield work included an observation from the trainer, a shield combat specialist named Yolanda Cruz, who had trained with some of the best operatives the organization had produced. That is worth examining in some detail. Cruz noted that Barnes learned the shield's specific throwing mechanics faster than any trainee she had worked with since beginning her instruction role, but that the quality of the learning was unusual. Most trainees, she wrote, learned the shield the way you learn any new weapon, through conscious repetition, through deliberate analysis of what worked and what didn't, through the slow construction of muscle memory from the outside in. Barnes appeared to learn it from the inside out, as though he wasn't building a new technique so much as recovering one, as though the movement pattern was not foreign to him but merely dormant, waiting to be reactivated. Cruz's observation was more than impressionistic. She had footage from the first week of training to compare against footage from the fourth week, and the comparison was not consistent with normal skill acquisition curves. Normally, there is a period of visible mechanical awkwardness during which the body is working through the new vocabulary before it internalizes it. Barnes's mechanical awkwardness lasted approximately 4 days, which was not nothing but was substantially shorter than any comparable baseline Cruz had data on. By the end of the first week, the throws were not refined. They were not yet the seamless extensions of intention that they would become, but they were already fundamentally correct in their geometry, their release point, their follow-through. He had gotten to the fundamental correctness very fast, and Cruz did not have a model for why. The answer, which Cruz did not have access to, is in the SSR training records from 1943. The SSR files document that Bucky Barnes had trained extensively with Steve Rogers in the use of the shield during the period before the Howling Commandos formation. Training that was informal, conducted in spare hours and on the edges of scheduled exercises, and that is mentioned in Steve's personal letters rather than in official documents. He had watched Steve for months before he had ever thrown the shield himself. He had watched the geometry of it, the angles, the way Steve's body moved through the throw and the recovery, with the attention he brought to everything he was trying to understand. He had never been formally trained in the shield's use, but he had been watching it used with expert precision for long enough that the pattern was somewhere in him, not in memory, because memory had been taken, but in the body's archive, the second record, the one the scientists had missed. He put the shield on his arm and walked out of the vault into the grey November morning, and the shield did not transform him, and the uniform that came later did not transform him, and there was no transformation. There was only a man who had already done the hardest thing and was now ready to do the next thing, which was merely harder in different ways. The world was about to meet someone it had not been expecting, and the world, whether it knew it or not, was exactly what it had been building toward. There is a version of Captain America that the world knows how to read. The costume telegraphs it. The colours, the star, the way the shield catches light and holds it for a moment before returning it. This is a visual vocabulary that 70 years of mythology had made legible. When people saw it, they knew what they were supposed to feel, which was a specific combination of security and aspiration that the figure had been engineered to produce, not cynically, but through the cumulative effect of decades of being the face on the poster and the name in the speech and the image people reached for when they wanted to describe something that could not be compromised. The world knew how to read the symbol. What the world did not know how to read, what required a new kind of attention, a different set of interpretive tools, was the specific person who was now wearing it. Bucky Barnes's first public appearance as Captain America in January 2015 did not go the way the SHIELD communications team had anticipated. They had anticipated mixed response, some percentage of the public that would be skeptical, some percentage enthusiastic, the usual distribution of opinion that follows any significant change to a beloved institution. What they had not anticipated was the particular quality of the skepticism, which was not primarily about Barnes's credentials or his physical capability, or even the general question of whether the mantle should be passed. The skepticism was about something more specific and more unsettling. It was about the face, not the features but the expression. The way he stood in the uniform was not the way Steve had stood in it, not the same quality of openness, the same instinctive presentation of availability, The same "we're all in this together" weight to the shoulders. Barnes stood as someone who was not expecting to be liked, who was not performing the charisma that the uniform had been designed to project, who had a quality in his face that could be read in several ways and was, in the subsequent days, read in most of them. The press used the words reserved and watchful. The social media response used other words, some of them accurate and some of them not. He was not performing. This was the thing. He had been, for a period of months before the public appearance, working with Natasha Romanoff on the elements of the public-facing role, the press engagement, the communication protocols, the management of the gap between what the role required in terms of public presentation and what it required operationally. Natasha was, among many other things, an expert in this management, having spent years performing identities that were not her own, with a precision that was almost as much a form of combat capability as her other skills. She had, in a series of conversations that Barnes later described in a S.H.I.E.L.D. debrief as the most useful and most uncomfortable he had experienced, attempted to help him understand what the uniform was asking him to project. The conversations had not produced the result she had anticipated. She had expected, given the scope of what Barnes had been through and the degree of his tactical intelligence, a calculated performance, someone who could model the public-facing warmth of the Captain America iconography, even if they did not feel it, who could give the uniform what it was asking for without confusion. What she found instead was someone who genuinely could not do this, not because he was incapable of performance. He had survived for decades in environments that required exactly this kind of calculated identity management, but because performing warmth he did not feel in this context, for this symbol felt to him like the specific kind of lie that would contaminate whatever he was trying to do. He could not put on the face of Captain America and maintain the conviction that he was actually being Captain America. The performance and the thing being performed were, for him, mutually exclusive, so he stopped trying to perform it. This was his decision, and Fury backed it, and the communications team was not consulted in advance, which the communications team did not appreciate, but which was consistent with the way Fury managed most things that mattered. Barnes went out in the uniform and was exactly what he was: present, observant, precise in the things he said and in the way he moved, with a quality of attention that people who were in proximity to him consistently described as feeling seen rather than managed. He did not perform warmth. He was actually interested in the people in front of him, and the interest was visible, and it was different from warmth, but it was not cold, and it was real in a way that performed warmth is not. The first mission was a hostage extraction in a port facility in Constanta, Romania. The operational details are classified above public access level, but the broad outline is documented in the Avengers operational summary that was released in a declassified form in 2017. The target was a cell that had been using the facility as a transit point for a category of weapons that the international treaty framework classified as requiring immediate interdiction. There were 17 hostages. The cell had significant firepower and a demonstrated willingness to use it. The operation as planned called for a coordinated entry at 3 access points with overlapping fields of coverage, a plan that was, by the assessment of the tactical team, clean and executable with acceptable risk parameters. Barnes changed the plan 40 minutes before the operation was scheduled to begin. He changed it because he had spent the 30 minutes before that 40 in the surveillance feed from the facility, watching the cell's personnel movement patterns, and he had identified a rotation irregularity that the original planning had not accounted for. a 5-minute window in the North Access Point coverage that opened every 70 minutes, and that would allow a 2-person entry without triggering the tripwire protocols. He proposed the modified plan, walked the tactical team through his reasoning, and acknowledged that the modification created a tighter margin on the primary extraction corridor. He also acknowledged that the original plan was sound. He simply believed the modified plan was better, and he was prepared to explain why in the specific language that operational planning requires, which is the language of probability and contingency, and what happens if the thing that could go wrong does. The modified plan succeeded. All 17 hostages were extracted. The cell was neutralized. The operation ran over the planned window by 14 minutes, due to a complication in the South Corridor that Barnes had flagged as a possible contingency and had already planned the response for. When the team was out and clear and the debrief was beginning, Sam Wilson, who had been on the operation in a support capacity and who had been watching Barnes throughout, said, in the informal language of a debrief that had not yet become official record, "He doesn't miss anything." This was not hyperbole. It was an accurate description of an operational quality that the team was beginning to understand was not about superhuman capability, it was about attention. Barnes paid attention the way a person pays attention when they have learned, very early and very thoroughly, that the thing you missed was the thing that killed people you cared about. This quality, the attention, the modification, the willingness to change the plan rather than execute a suboptimal version of it, because the plan had been agreed upon, was not what the mythology of Captain America had prepared people to expect. The mythology had a heroic register that was different from this. The mythology was about the stand, the line drawn and held, the moment when everything reduced to the right thing and the wrong thing, and the person who would not move from the right thing regardless of cost. That register was real and was part of what Steve Rogers had been, but it was the visible surface of something deeper, and the deeper thing, the attention, the analysis, the modification, the relentless practical intelligence in service of the people who needed to get home, was what Barnes was made of. He was not performing the mythology, he was doing the work that the mythology was describing. And the difference, in practice, in a port facility in Romania at 11 o'clock at night with 17 people who needed to get home, was everything. The world's reception of Captain America evolved in the months that followed. Not without friction. The friction was real and sustained, and it was not limited to the predictable corners of public opinion. There were serious arguments, made by serious people, about the symbolic weight of someone with Barnes's history occupying the role. There were questions about what it meant for a man who had spent decades as an involuntary weapon to become a voluntary one, and whether the distinction was adequate, and whether the symbol of American virtue could be carried by someone whose biography included its opposite. These questions were not easy. Barnes did not pretend they were easy. In the press engagements that S.H.I.E.L.D. managed carefully, he addressed them with the same directness that characterized everything else he did, not defensively, not apologetically, but with the steadiness of someone who had already had the argument with himself at greater length and with higher stakes than any external questioner could replicate. In one exchange documented in a S.H.I.E.L.D. transcript from a press engagement in March 2015, a reporter asked him directly, "Do you think you deserve to carry that shield?" He was quiet for a moment, his characteristic 45-second pause, somewhat compressed under the circumstances, and then he said, "I think the shield deserves to be carried by someone who does the work, and I'm going to do the work. Whether that's the same thing as deserving it, That's a question I don't think I'm the right person to answer." The room was quiet for a moment after this. Then another reporter asked the next question, and the press engagement continued, and the transcript noted that several journalists afterward described the exchange as the most honest thing they had heard at one of these events in years. One of them wrote a column about it that used the phrase "a different kind of symbol," and the phrase circulated in ways that shaped the conversation about what Bucky Barnes as Captain America was and was not going forward. The false peak came in May 2015. This is how things often work. The period of maximum acceptance. The moment when the argument seems settled and the thing that seemed impossible seems possible, and then actual and then normal, tends to arrive just before the thing that shows you how much work is still left to do. In May 2015, a YouGov poll found that 58% of Americans who were aware of the new Captain America expressed approval of the transition. 58% was not a majority of the country, which had approximately 42% of the population with no awareness of the transition at all, but it was a majority of the informed population, and it was higher than similar polls in February and March had projected. The S.H.I.E.L.D. communications team was quietly pleased. The Oversight Committee issued a memo that used the phrase "initial stabilization of public narrative." Tony Stark read the memo and told someone privately that they were going to have to stop calling it stabilization when the next thing happened, because the next thing always happened. He was right. Tony Stark's response to the new Captain America was predictably complicated in ways that were not entirely visible on the surface. The surface response was supportive in a pragmatic key. He had argued for deploying the shield rather than storing it, and Barnes deploying the shield was the logical extension of that argument, and Tony respected logical extensions of arguments he had made. But underneath the pragmatic support was something that he mentioned to no one, that appeared in no official record, that existed only as a quality in the way he sometimes looked at Barnes when Barnes was not looking at him, which several of his colleagues noticed and none of them mentioned, because everyone on the team had learned that Tony's unspoken things were best left unspoken until he was ready. Howard Stark had known Bucky Barnes. Not well. Not the way he had known Steve Rogers, which was with the particular intensity of a working relationship built on extraordinary circumstances and genuine mutual respect. He had known Barnes the way you know, the person who is always present when the person you're paying attention to is present, peripherally, as context, as the reliable figure in the background that you don't register as fully as the figure in the foreground because the figure in the foreground is more legible, more available to your categories. Howard's records from 1944 and 1945, his personal journals, which Tony had read and reread over the years in the way that people read documents that bring them closer to parents they are still working out how to understand, mentioned Barnes perhaps a dozen times. The mentions were always in relationship to Steve. Barnes was there. Barnes handled the perimeter. Barnes was the one who stayed in communication while Steve went in. The mentions registered Barnes as a reliable fact of operational life, and if there was more than that in Howard's estimation, he did not record it. What Tony found himself noticing in the months after Barnes took the shield was that he was paying a different kind of attention than his father had. He was noticing Barnes, specifically, in the way you notice someone when you have stopped taking them for granted. He was noticing the quality of Barnes's decisions in the field, and the quality of his attention in briefings, and the specific way he interacted with the non-Avengers S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel, the people who were neither peers nor subordinates, but the vast middle layer of operational support, the people who were easy to treat as background, Barnes did not treat them as background. He knew their names. He remembered things from previous conversations. He was toward them exactly what he was toward everyone else. Genuinely interested, specifically attentive, present in a way that was not performed. Tony found this interesting in the way he found genuinely interesting things interesting, which was without defensiveness and without reservation. He filed it in the part of his mind where he kept things that were changing his assessment of the situation, and he let it work on him. The next thing happened in June, and it came not from outside but from inside, from the part of the story that had been building since 1945 and that could not be kept at arm's length forever. The past that is always present in a person who has lived through it, whether or not they remember it, whether or not they want it there, whether or not the timing is convenient for the mythology they are trying to inhabit. There are things you carry and there are things that carry you. The distinction is not about size or weight. Some of the things that carry you are very small, a sentence you heard once, a photograph, the specific angle of light in a room where something happened. The things that carry you are not necessarily heavier than the things you carry. They are different in kind rather than degree. The things you carry you set down sometimes. You choose when to lift them and when to rest. The things that carry you do not ask permission and do not wait for a convenient moment. They arrive when they arrive, and you are in them before you know it, and the only question is what you do with the being in them, whether you let them take you somewhere destructive or whether you find, somehow, the navigation to take them somewhere useful instead. The specific event that initiated what the Avengers Operational After Action Report calls the June incident was a Freedom of Information Act disclosure that should not have been disclosed at the level it was. The disclosure came through a procedural error at a government records office, a misfiling, a wrong classification, the kind of administrative mistake that happens in large bureaucracies with high-volume paperwork, and that in this case had consequences far larger than the administrative process had any mechanism for anticipating. The disclosed documents were a subset of a Hydra operational archive that S.H.I.E.L.D. had been reviewing internally for 2 years, specifically the portion of the archive that documented Winter Soldier operations between 1975 and 1990, with operational targets named and engagement details described. The targets were named, the engagement details were described. The documents became public on a Thursday afternoon and were being widely circulated by Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, journalists had begun the work of identifying the named targets against public records, and by the following Monday, 3 of the 17 confirmed deaths documented in the archive had been matched to public figures whose names the general public recognized. Not politicians, the targets were not of that profile, but scientists and analysts and one investigative journalist whose death in 1983 had been officially ruled a suicide and whose family had never believed it and had said so publicly and had been told quietly by the officials they contacted that there was no evidence for any other conclusion, and now there was evidence, and the evidence was in the disclosed documents, and the journalist's daughter was 53 years old and was being interviewed on every major news platform and was saying things that were precise and controlled and completely devastating. Barnes learned about the disclosure the way most people learned about it, which is to say through a notification on his device in an ordinary moment. He was in the S.H.I.E.L.D. facility, in the training space, running the technique work he continued to do for several hours each day because the technique work was the meditation, the thing that ordered the mind through the body rather than through language, the thing that made the rest of the day navigable. He looked at the notification. He understood immediately what it meant. He set the device down and sat for a moment with a particular quality of stillness that his colleagues had learned to recognize as the precursor to something careful and considered rather than impulsive, and then he asked to see Fury. He told Fury he wanted to make a statement. Fury did not immediately agree. He outlined the reasons, the legal exposure, the communications complexity, the risk of compounding the disclosure rather than managing its aftermath. Barnes listened to the reasons with the quality of attention he brought to everything, and then he said that he understood the reasons and wanted to make the statement anyway, and he wanted to make it publicly, not through intermediaries or prepared text, because the thing that the disclosure required was not management. It required acknowledgement. Fury was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What are you going to say?" Barnes said. "The truth, as completely as I can tell it. And then the part after the truth." Fury said, "What's the part after the truth?" Barnes said, "That the truth doesn't end it, that someone has to do something about it, that I'm the someone who's going to, if they'll let me." The statement he made 2 days later at a press event that was the most attended SHIELD-associated public event since the Battle of New York was not the statement the communications team had drafted. The communications team had drafted something that acknowledged the history, expressed appropriate regret, and pivoted to the ongoing work, the standard 3-beat structure of institutional response to institutional harm. Barnes had read the draft and had set it aside and had written something else. What he wrote and what he delivered in the measured, quiet voice that his press appearances had established as his register, never raised, never theatrical, always in the timbre of someone who was saying the thing rather than performing the saying of it, was substantially different. He acknowledged the operations by name where the names were available. He did not use the passive voice, which the communications draft had used extensively, in the way that institutional communications use the passive voice when they want to acknowledge that something happened without specifying that a person did it. He said, "I did these things." He said it with the specific weight of someone who understood both the impossibility and the necessity of that sentence. The impossibility because the person who did those things was not precisely the person standing at the podium. The necessity because the body that did them was his, and the body does not get to disclaim what it was used for. He said, "I was not myself when I did them, and this is true, and it is also not sufficient." He said, "The families of the people who were killed are owed more than an explanation. They are owed what I can give them now, which is not enough, and which I am going to spend a significant part of the rest of my life attempting to make more sufficient through the work I can actually do." He said, "I am not asking for your trust. I understand that trust is earned and not asked for, and I have done things that make the earning of it harder rather than easier. I am asking for the opportunity to begin." The response to the statement was not what the communications team had predicted, which is to say it was not predictable at all. A significant portion of the public response was what might be expected. The portion that had already been skeptical found the statement confirmatory and said so loudly. But another portion, and it was not a small one, and it was not the portion that anyone in the SHIELD communications infrastructure had thought to cultivate, was quieter and more surprised and more complicated. The journalist's daughter was in the room. She had been granted access at her own request. She was one of the people who had said things that were precise and controlled and completely devastating, and she had said them with the full entitlement of someone whose grief was legitimate and whose anger was legitimate, and who had been denied the truth for 40 years. She listened to the statement, and then she asked a question, and the question was this: What are you going to do about the people who built the system that used you?" Barnes looked at her across the room for a moment. Then he said, "Find them where they still exist. Stop them. That is the primary operational commitment I am making with this role, and I will not stop making it until it is done, or I am not capable of continuing." She did not say anything in response. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something real has been said. Not something performed, but something actual. Something that has the weight of a person's whole history behind it. The aftermath of the June incident was not a resolution. This is worth being clear about. The world did not come to terms with the history, and the families who were affected did not achieve the kind of closure that the word implies. Because closure is rarely what grief actually achieves, and the word is doing too much work. What happened was more modest and more real. A process began. A formal acknowledgement was made. A commitment to the specific, sustained, unglamorous work of addressing the harm was made public and, more importantly, was begun. Barnes worked with S.H.I.E.L.'s legal and intelligence teams to identify surviving Hydra elements with direct connections to the Winter Soldier program, and the work was slow and methodical, and not well suited to the kind of narrative that public attention sustains, and he did it anyway, which is the kind of doing that matters most. The mythology of Captain America had always been about the clear moment, the right thing unmistakably, and the person who would do it. This is the mythology's greatest gift and also its greatest limitation. It makes virtue look simple, and simple virtue is the one thing virtue is not. The actual work, the work that Steve Rogers had done before the mythology crystallized around him, and the work that Barnes was now doing in a situation that the mythology had not prepared anyone for, was not clear. It was full of competing claims and insufficient information, and the constant low-grade difficulty of acting rightly in a world that does not hold still long enough for you to be certain. This is the real content of the shield. Not the vibranium, not the colours, not the star at the centre. The real content of the shield is the willingness to act in the absence of certainty, because something has to be done, and you are the person who is committed to doing it. Bucky Barnes had been the clearest possible demonstration in his own history that human beings can be used and misused and rebuilt and redirected and stripped of everything that makes them themselves, and that this is not the end of them. The most important thing he carried was not the shield. The most important thing he carried was the proof, lived in his own body, that the worst that can be done to a person does not determine what the person does next. This was not the Captain America mythology. It was something more difficult and more durable, not a symbol of what could be achieved, but a demonstration of what could be survived. And survival, it turned out, was what the moment was asking for. The families of the Winter Soldier's victims were not a monolith in their response to the June disclosure, or to Barnes's statement in its aftermath. This is worth establishing clearly, because the narrative that formed around the event tended towards simplification, as narratives do. The simplification said, there was harm, there was acknowledgement, there was a kind of beginning of repair. The simplification was not false. These things were true, but it smoothed over the texture of what actually happened, which was more varied and less resolved. Some families found the statement inadequate and said so, publicly and with precision. Some found it more than they had expected and were uncertain what to do with that finding. Some families declined to engage at all, which is a legitimate response to the situation of being asked to receive an acknowledgement from the person responsible for an irreversible loss. The spectrum of responses was the appropriate response to a situation that did not have a clean emotional outcome, and Barnes understood this, or he said he did, and his behaviour in the months that followed was consistent with the understanding. He did not expect absolution. He did not seek it. He did not frame what he was doing as the path to having his history recontextualized. He framed it as the path to doing less harm going forward than had been done in the past, which was a more modest ambition and a more achievable one. Natasha Romanoff, who had her own history with the Hydra mnemonic suppression program, and who had emerged from her own version of that history through processes that she described to almost no one, but that had left marks as visible to those who knew how to look as Barnes's arm was visible to anyone with eyes, said something to him in the weeks after the statement that he mentioned in a S.H.I.E.L.D. psychological check-in as the most useful thing anyone had said to him about the situation. She said, "The point is not to become clean. The point is to become accountable, which is harder than clean and also more honest. Clean is what you want before the thing happens. After the thing has happened, the best available state is accountable, which means carrying the weight of it without letting the weight become the reason for inaction." Barnes had, in his personal note taken at that check-in, written down one word: yes. The Hydra cells that Barnes targeted in the operational campaign that followed the June incident were not large or dramatically powerful. They were the remaining fragments of a program that had already been substantially dismantled through S.H.I.E.L.D. operations over the preceding years, the surviving elements of an organizational structure that had depended on secrecy and had been losing its secrecy for a decade. The work was grinding and incremental and unglamorous, the opposite of the kind of operation that generates narrative, and Barnes approached it with the systematic patience of someone who understood that this was exactly the right approach, that the thing deserved to be done thoroughly rather than visibly, that the metric was completion rather than coverage. He completed more of it than the operational projections had estimated. Faster than the timeline had suggested was achievable. He did not draw attention to this. The work was done because it needed to be done, and it needed to be done because specific people had been harmed, and the accounting for that harm did not care about the timeline's projections. The past had come back, as the past does, in the most direct and least comfortable way available to it. And the thing that met it, rather than deflecting or managing or performing a response adequate to the mythology's demands, was a person who had already been through the worst of it, who stood in the center of the storm of his own history and did not move, not because he was unaffected, but because he had learned, somewhere in the long work of coming back to himself, that stillness in the storm is what the work actually looks like. There are nights in Washington, in the long middle of winter, when the city becomes very quiet in a way that is unusual for a city of its size and pace and ambient noise. The noise never truly stops, but it settles, like sediment settling to the bottom of a glass of water that has been allowed to stand long enough. The monuments are lit, as they always are, and the light they cast on the surrounding grounds is soft and steady, the kind of light that does not ask anything of you, that does not require any particular response. It simply illuminates. It makes things visible. This is what monuments are for at their best, not to instruct or to compel, but to make something visible that might otherwise be missed in the dark, to hold a light steady over something that deserves to be seen. In the spring of 2016, approximately 16 months after Bucky Barnes first picked up the S.H.I.E.L.D. in the archival vault, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s assessment team completed the first comprehensive review of his tenure in the Captain America role. The review was classified at a level consistent with its operational detail, but the summary, cleared for broader internal distribution, used language that was, for an official S.H.I.E.L.D. document, notably direct. The summary noted that the transition had been operationally successful beyond initial projections. It noted that Barnes's tactical capabilities and decision-making in field conditions had been evaluated as matching or exceeding the highest comparable benchmarks available. It noted that public acceptance metrics, while initially lower than hoped, had evolved in a direction consistent with sustainable institutional support. And then, in its final paragraph, the summary said something that none of the earlier sections had prepared the reader for. The review committee noted that the Winter Soldier program, in attempting to produce the perfect weapon, had instead preserved the qualities that make an effective symbol, specifically the quality of being recognizably human in the midst of extraordinary circumstance. This was, in the dry language of institutional assessment, a significant observation. What the committee was saying, what they were saying in the most cautious and hedged way available to an official document, was that the thing Hydra had tried to do to James Barnes had not produced what Hydra intended. They had aimed to build a weapon without a self, and instead they had built a person who understood from the inside what the removal of selfhood cost, who was therefore more acutely aware of its value than someone who had never had it threatened. They had aimed to remove loyalty and had instead, through the intrusive subroutines and the persistent failures of calibration, demonstrated that loyalty is not stored where it can be found and extracted. It is somewhere deeper and darker and more resistant to interference than the scientists had understood. They had aimed to make him nothing, and instead they had shown what remained when everything else was taken away. And what remained was the essential thing. Steve Rogers was a dream that the country needed in 1941, a dream calibrated specifically to that moment, to the particular combination of threat and aspiration that the moment contained, to a world that needed someone to embody the possibility of doing the right thing in conditions that made the right thing costly. He was made for that moment, and he was perfect for it, and the myth that formed around him was real, in the way that myths are real when they are built on something genuine. His virtue was genuine, his courage was genuine, his belief in the essential worth of ordinary people was genuine. The serum amplified what was there, but what was there was already sufficient. Steve Rogers was exactly what the myth said he was. This is a rare thing, and the rarity of it is part of why the myth held for 70 years. But the world that Bucky Barnes walked into in 2015 was not 1941. It was a world that had spent those 70 years discovering, repeatedly and painfully, the gap between the ideal and the actual, the gap between what the country said it was and what it demonstrably did, between the standard the mythology held out and the practice that the mythology was sometimes used to excuse rather than to demand. It was a world that had, through specific and recurring historical experience, developed a healthy and appropriate skepticism about claims of virtue, a world that had learned to look for what was underneath the performance rather than at the performance itself. A perfect dream in this world could be dismissed as too simple, not because the dream was wrong, but because the world had learned to be suspicious of simplicity with reason. What Bucky Barnes offered was not simplicity. He offered something more difficult and more specifically suited to the moment, the image of someone who had been through the worst that could be done to a person and had come back from it, not unchanged, not uncomplicated, not unburdened by what the journey had cost, but still going, still doing the work, still, against every reasonable expectation, oriented toward the people in front of him, rather than toward the catastrophe behind him. This was not the symbol the mythology had prepared people to receive, and it was precisely the symbol the world needed. Not a man who had never been broken, but a man who had been broken entirely, and was still choosing, daily and without drama, to be something better than what the breaking had made him. The shield in the hands of James Barnes did not mean what it had meant in Steve's hands. It meant something adjacent, something related but not identical, a neighbouring point on the same long axis. Steve's shield meant, I will protect you, and the protection comes from strength, and the strength comes from something incorruptible in me. And you can trust that incorruptibility because I have never been tested against the thing that could compromise it. Bucky's shield meant something harder to articulate and harder to dismiss. I was tested against the worst that could be done, and something survived, and I am using what survived to protect you, and the protection is real even though I cannot promise you that it comes from a place of perfect goodness, only from a place of persistent trying. This is not as clean as Steve's version. It does not fit as easily on a poster, but it is, for a world that has learned to look underneath the poster, a more honest and in some ways more durable form of reassurance. The central irony of James Buchanan Barnes's life, stated as plainly as possible, he was dismissed because he was the one who did the dark work. He was called the sidekick because his job was the job that made the hero's job possible, and the hero's job was the one that got the mythology. The dark work, the intelligence, the surveillance, the operations that took place before the assault team arrived, the willingness to go through the kitchen drain rather than the front door, was the work that made everything else work. And then Hydra took that exact quality, the willingness to operate in the dark, to do what needed to be done without the comfort of daylight or witness or celebration, and weaponized it against him, built 70 years of harm on top of it. And then he survived the weaponization, and he came back to himself, and what he brought back from the dark, what that dark had shown him, what it had preserved of him against its own intentions, was the thing that made him right for the moment, not despite the darkness, because of what survived it. Nick Fury wrote in his personal log in the autumn of 2016 a sentence that was unusual enough in the context of Fury's writing that the archivist who eventually reviewed the log flagged it as anomalous. The sentence was, the shield was always going to end up here. He did not elaborate. He did not explain what he meant by here, or what inevitability he was describing, or whether the here was this specific person, or this specific kind of person, or something more abstract. The always impending arrival of the symbol into the hands of someone who had earned the right to it through loss rather than through aspiration. The sentence was in the log. It sat there in Fury's careful handwriting, and it said what it said, and it did not ask to be unpacked. In the years that followed, and there were years, many of them, with the specific texture and weight and unresolved quality of actual time rather than narrative time, Barnes carried the shield in the way that he had always carried the things that mattered to him. Not loudly, not with ceremony, not in the way that mythologies are carried, which is with the conscious awareness that you are the bearer of something the world is watching. He carried it the way he had carried everything important since the 1930s, which was with the straightforward, unperformative commitment of someone who had decided that the thing deserved the carrying, and that the carrying deserved the doing well. He did it. Day by day, mission by mission, in the training spaces in the morning, and the field operations in the dark and the press engagements in between, he did it. Steve Rogers stayed in the ice. He was there still, in the deep cold, in the suspension that was neither death nor life, in the moment of his last choice which had been the right choice, and which had cost him everything, which is what right choices sometimes do. The world had built a myth around his absence, and the myth had been both real and insufficient, as myths always are. And the world had found, in the space the myth was trying to fill, not the thing the myth expected, but something the myth had not known to look for. A man who understood the cost from the inside, who had paid it in a different currency, who was still paying it, who carried the shield not because he was the rightful heir to a mythology, but because the world needed protecting, and he was the one who was there, and he was going to do the work. Let the weight of the day settle around you now. The story does not end with a trumpet note or a bright light or a resolution so complete that nothing remains to be done. The best stories do not end that way. They end with the work continuing, with someone in the field who will get up tomorrow and do it again. And this is not a diminishment of the story, but the fullest version of it. The version that asks something of you rather than simply providing an emotion to have and set down. Let that sink into the darkness of wherever you are. Let the story breathe its way down into stillness. James Barnes carried the shield, and he was not Steve Rogers, and the shield was not the same in his hands, and the world was not the same world Steve had known, and none of these things were the problems the mythology had told you they were. They were the story. They were the shape the story had to take to be true. And true was the only kind of worth having. The monuments light the night in Washington. The city settles. The weight of accumulated history presses gently into the dark and does not demand anything of you now. Whatever you were carrying when you came to this story, set it down for a while. The work will be there when you return to it. The work is always there. But this moment, this quiet, this dark, this particular configuration of you and the night and the story just finished, this does not come back. Let it be what it is. Let it carry you for a little while. If you are still here, still awake in any part of yourself that notices these words, let the noticing become less sharp. Let the edges of things soften. The story has said what it came to say. The rest is silence, which is not absence but the fullest presence of what has been. Somewhere in the deep, in the cold, in the ice that keeps its own counsel, something waits for a spring that will come in its own time. And here, where you are, in the warmth and the dark and the particular quiet of this moment, something rests. Let it rest. Let yourself rest with it. The question of what happens to a symbol when the person carrying it insists on being a person, rather than a symbol, is one that every iconic figure in the Captain America lineage had confronted in some form, but that Barnes confronted with a directness and a lack of available evasion that made it unusually visible. Steve Rogers, in the versions of events in which he was present, had the option of defaulting to the symbol when the person became too complicated or too costly, not because he was dishonest, but because the symbol's vocabulary was so available to him, so natural, so consistent with who he actually was, that the gap between the symbol and the person was narrow enough to paper over when necessary. Barnes did not have this option. The gap between the symbol and the person was not narrow. It was the most visible thing about him. Every time he appeared in the uniform, the gap was present. The history was present. The arm was present. The face that was not Steve's face was present. And there was nothing to do with that presence but acknowledge it, or ignore it. And he had made the choice to acknowledge it, and the choice had consequences that he had anticipated and accepted. The consequence that he had anticipated most clearly was the ongoing debate. The debate that did not end with the press statement in January 2015, or with the June disclosure, or with the statement that followed it. The debate that seemed to be something the world was going to maintain indefinitely, as a background condition of his existence in the role. The debate said, is this right? Is this the right person, for the right reasons, doing the right things, in the right way? The debate was legitimate, and Barnes's position on it was consistent throughout. The debate was the world's to have, not his to resolve. He could not answer the question of whether he was right for the role, because rightness is assessed from outside, and he was inside it, and the assessment from inside, the only one available to him, was simply that the work needed doing, and he was going to do it, and the outside assessment could proceed on its own time and reach its own conclusions. What gradually shifted across the months and years of the work continuing was not the content of the debate, but its register. It became, over time, less urgent, less freighted with the anxiety of a question that needed to be settled before anything else could proceed. The question of whether Bucky Barnes was the right Captain America began to be asked alongside the accumulated evidence of what Bucky Barnes as Captain America had actually done, and the evidence had a specific weight that opinion alone did not, and the weight was slow, but it was real. 17 hostages in Constanta, the Hydra dismantlement operation completed and documented and not undone. The statement in June, and everything that followed from it, imperfect and insufficient and the beginning of something rather than the end. The conversations with the S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel who were not his peers, whose names he knew. The daily, unglamorous, unglorified work of someone who had decided that the S.H.I.E.L.D. was not a prize but a commitment, and commitments did not wait for the world to confirm they were appropriate before they required keeping. If this story settled into you the way a good story should, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is. I'm always curious about that, about the different rooms and different nights, and different varieties of quiet where these stories find their way to people who need them. If you have a topic you would like to hear, leave it below. Sleep well wherever you are.